Welcome, I'm Nelufar. This is Dear World Live.
How do we construct our economy in a way that is climate friendly?
It's 2 times as difficult for disabled people dealing with COVID than it is for their non-disabled peers.
How do we actually ensure women's inclusion? How do we ensure women's safety?
This is indeed Dear World Live. I am still Nelufar Hedayat. Welcome to season 2 of our show. We are so glad that you are here. For those of you who tuned into season 1, welcome back. For those of you who are new here, welcome, welcome. In our last season, we tackled the coronavirus and the upheaval and change that it has caused in our lives around the globe. This season, we're looking at an equally important and seismic event. We will be tackling the issues surrounding racism and racial justice around the globe. Each week, we'll look at a different aspect that is very important to this conversation. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by my 2 wonderful guests, Marc Lamont and Mikki Kendall, who are going to be joining the conversation. But first, for the season, I want to set the scene a little bit. We're talking about racism and racial justice in the US in this episode. 400 years after enslaved people were first brought to America, the streets of the US cities are echoing with chants of justice and peace as protesters are fighting for their voices to be heard in response to the killings of Black people at the hands of police. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Just some of the Black men and women killed by the police in modern America. Now, that video of George Floyd's death showing the police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck for more than 8 minutes is haunting. But it did lead to a groundswell of support for organizations like Black Lives Matter and rallies of solidarity all over the world, including here in my hometown of London, where I'm coming to you from right now. Now, today, as one of the most divisive elections in the history of the United States is almost upon us, we are asking a pertinent question. Is this a moment for real change in the United States? Now, to answer that question, I will soon be joined by my wonderful guests. But first, we asked one of our friends from our shared studio network a question. What was the first time that he realized that the US has a race problem? This is Ruben from Washington, D.C.
When I was 11 years old, I was mourning the loss of Trayvon Martin. At 11 o'clock, my grade school classmates and I left the building in our hoodies and took part in a moment of silence. I could not yet contextualize the emotional strain that the elders and my community members of my life were dealing with. I couldn't see that this was the spark of the movement that would influence my life. Leading into my time at high school, I was suddenly a part of a student body that was only 3% Black, and with each racist incident, that emotional strain became more familiar as I dealt with incidents of blackface racism and vandalism. In August of this year, things came full circle when I went to the March on Washington and heard the voice of Trayvon Martin's mother echoing across the National Mall. She was joined on stage by countless family members of other victims of police and racist violence. I thought about what I knew when I was 11 and I heard Trayvon Martin's name for the first time and what I know now 8 years later. I didn't realize it then, but that was the incident that awakened my mind to the cruel nature of racism in this country.
It's extremely powerful words there from Ruben and his awakening, his moment that he came to realize something needed to be done. Dear World Live is nothing without you, my dear viewers. Whether you're tuning in on Twitch, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, you are so welcome, and I always want to hear from you. Hello to Michael, Alvira, Vishal, Mohammed, Solange, you are all welcome here. Remember to send in your comments, your question, your thoughts. Are we having the right conversation here? What do you think? I want to hear from you. Get in touch with us. just drop a comment wherever it is you're watching. Tell me where you're from, who you are, and what your comment or question is. Okay, without any more further ado, let's get into this. I want to get to my two guests. Today, I am joined by Marc Lamont Hill, author, activist, and abolitionist. He's a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia and has written the upcoming book, We Still Here: Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility. Also joining me is Mikki Kendall. She's a writer, a diversity consultant, and a feminist. She's the author of Hood Feminism and Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists, a graphic history of women's fight for their rights. We will be joined by our active audience member who's joining me this week. Vickiana Petit-Homme is studying political science at the University of Massachusetts. She's also an organizing director at March for Our Lives, which is a youth-led organization protesting to end all types of gun violence. Hello to you all. Say a very quick hello.
Hello.
I'm glad to have you for this, our first episode of season 2. Marc, coming from you first. The world, as we know it, has changed. The last time I saw you, we were in Doha, and the world was unrecognizable. There was no coronavirus. There was very little going on about a global recognition of the Black Lives Matter movement. Everything has changed, especially in the US. Has the coronavirus, for example, Marc, shown the injustices when it comes to the racial disparity in the United States? Has that been a contributor to this moment that we're having?
It's absolutely a contributor to the moment that we're having. You know, it's important to recognize that racial injustice, racial inequality, white supremacy are integral features of American life. There's never been a moment where there's been in America and there haven't been these issues, these forces. So we have to be honest about that. But what COVID-19 did was it put yet another spotlight on the intersections of race and class and gender and ability and so many other things. But what we saw early on was a narrative that there was an infection, a disease, an illness going around the world that was colorblind and universal, and everyone was equally vulnerable. What we
Absolutely
was that the poor, the economically vulnerable, disproportionately Black and brown people were the primary victims of this. And so at that moment, again, we saw more inequality. We saw how race became a key factor in this.
It's almost as though it was, to me, sitting in my house in London, looking at the US from a distance, I was just like, you can't ignore this. You can't ignore this anymore. It's the conversation for so long has been couched in all these like really stereotypical terms, but the coronavirus seems to shake all of that and just bring it to the fore. It shook loose so much of that dust. And you speak about a lot of this in Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility. Tell me a little bit about what motivated you to write this book.
You know, I was trying to make sense of the world at a moment where so much was happening. George Floyd had been killed, Breonna Taylor had been killed, Ahmaud Arbery had been killed. I wanted to go to a protest to protest state violence. And I was like, my 92-year-old father, I haven't seen in months, and he's in a nursing home, and I want to be able to see him. If I go to this pandemic, if I go to this protest, I could get COVID, I could infect him. And so I was at this moment where I had to decide whether I was going to stay at home and not challenge the state killing us, or whether I was going to go outside and risk death. And at that moment, I was like, you know, this is in many ways emblematic of what it means to be Black in America. Which way am I going to risk death? Which way am I going to confront death today? And that's make no circumstance.
That's extremely hard to hear. You know, the fact that that's really hard to hear, that for you, that was an equivalent. The coronavirus can kill you, but you feel that so can being a Black man.
A Black man or Black woman. I mean, think about how many poor people, men and women, were forced to work for these major multinational corporations, and were forced to work at Tyson Foods, or forced to work in these places where they were the front line of risk with no economic support, no vulnerability. And then we add other issues, and Mikki talks about this brilliantly in her work, and I talk about this in the book. I mean, think about people who were forced to the domestic sphere where they couldn't get out of the house. So what does that mean for domestic violence? What does that mean for people who live in housing projects where they can't stand 6 feet? All of this stuff. Social distance is an index of privilege as much as it is an index of medical awareness. And so we have to talk about all this stuff.
Mikki, I'm so excited talking to you. This is brilliant. And Marc mentioned the work that you do on that intersection between being a BIPOC person, a person of color, but also maybe poor, maybe also a woman, and that compounding effect. You've written and spoken eloquently about this. What do you have to add to that?
So I'm going to point out that we're in a place that was completely predictable, but also completely avoidable. And we've chosen not to avoid it in America and in many other countries, but America is where we're talking about. So one of the things that we're seeing play out here, I talk a lot about social safety nets in my work, about things like food stamps and housing and things like that, stuff that allows you to be able to stay home, stuff that allows you to be able to make the kind of decisions that in a public health crisis, we are now being asked to make, right? Stay home, stay alive, but we didn't do anything about homelessness. We didn't do anything about unsafe homes. We didn't do anything about what it means to not be able to afford to stay home. And so now we're saying, well, we want people to go back to work, keep the economy going, but we don't want them to need anything from us. We just want them to provide this to us. And like Marc pointed out, social distancing is a marker of privilege. And I would argue that being able, even if you are able to sort of socially distance, to stay home and that kind of thing, when you're in a situation where like Breonna Taylor or even Rekia Boyd was the case here in Chicago, where you're not doing anything wrong, where maybe like Ayanna Stanley Jones or Catherine Johnston, which is the case in Atlanta, where police can bust into your home and kill you.
Let me jump in there. Let me jump in there because you mentioned a really important thing. But I want to know, is your message being received differently by people like me, by people like Saloma, who's watching in Brazil, by people like Malik, who's watching in Pakistan? Do you think that that message that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to propagate, is trying to get out there, is being heard in a different way today?
I think it's being heard more clearly now. I think for a lot of people who had not really grasped the scope of police brutality and misconduct. Like I'm from Chicago. So I grew up in one of the only American cities that has a police torture center because we had a case of police officers torturing and framing people across years, right? So that's the framework from which I'm operating. I think for people outside the US, it's almost impossible to believe how bad things can be until you have those videos, until you see in the long form, and this is not to say that what happened to George Floyd should have been necessary or should have been what we needed to make the conversation shift, but to see how casual that violence can be, it changes how we perceive the conversations about race and racism and privilege.
Absolutely.
And I was gonna say, and for a lot of people who maybe hadn't seen it before, they suddenly realized it could be them.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Interesting moment in history in 2020 where these two things seem to just highlight one another, the coronavirus pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. For those of you who are joining us, welcome. This is season 2 of Dear World Live. I'm Nelufar Hedayat. You are watching our wonderful guests, Marc Lamont Hill and Mikki Kendall, talk. We are momentarily going to be joined by one of our viewers, actually, Vickiana Petit-Homme, a student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's just actually gotten out of the car, found a quiet place just to be on this show. That's the kind of fandom that I want to encourage. Vickiana, let's turn to you very quickly. You heard a lot of what Marc had to say and what Mikki had to say. What do you think about the conversation we're having in general? Do you think this is what we should be talking about when it comes to racial injustice in the United States?
Yes, for sure. I definitely think we need to be talking about all this because it's the way that racism presents itself in the United States is like no other. It's very ingrained from the very founding to our institutions and just to how people want to play politics right now. And I also think it's very important just to have this conversation in general because when anti-Blackness is it's a global struggle, you know, racism is a global issue. And so I think looking at the US is a good place to start. And just have those conversations about also how these problems kind of persist even in other countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vickiana. I'm glad that you're following the conversation so far. If I can have all of my guests up at once, both Marc, Mikki, there you are. Hello, my beautiful folks. I've got a very quick question for you. Raise your hands if you've been out on a Black Lives Matter protest. Raise your hand if you've been out on more than one. Okay, so you guys know what it's like to be there on the ground. Vickiana, do you have a question for our guest? Because I want to start talking about the Black Lives Matter movement itself, and I want to let you have that first question.
Yeah, my question for y'all is, we have this election coming up, and I think a lot of this debate or leading up to this election, people have been talking about settling for Biden. This idea that even he is not good enough. And I guess, and we've also been engaging in this conversation of, should we even vote for either of them? And so I would love to hear your thoughts on this about how to engage Black folks in this idea of voting on November 3rd for these two candidates who some would say are very, very similar, just with different faces.
So should the BIPOC, the Black community in America, vote for either of the presidential candidates, Donald Trump or Joseph Biden? Who wants to take that on? Neither of you look very...
No, I'm ready. Hold on. Let's be clear here. Again, this is Chicago politics talking. I have very rarely in the history of voting, I've voted since I was 18. I turned 44 Friday. I have voted for decades. I was going to protest before Black Lives Matter was a slogan. I was going to protest in Chicago about police brutality, about a lot of the issues that BLM addresses. I rarely have been able to choose a candidate that I liked. I can actually say possibly twice in my lifetime, I've been able to vote for someone who I didn't find disgusting. And even then, they weren't necessarily someone I liked so much as it was, well, this is the best of the bad option. Okay. I think the last actual candidate I really liked was probably Harold Washington, which most of you won't know, but he was a Chicago mayor. I was 8. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. So I think that we have to stop thinking of voting as a solution and think of voting as harm reduction. I would argue that between the two, we have one that wants to be a dictator and we have one that doesn't. And I know that the bar is so low as to be under our feet, but that is where we are, right? And I see people saying that, BLM is violent and all of these.
Okay, I'm gonna stop with Mikki there. This is live, folks. We're doing the best that we can. Mikki, we lost you momentarily, but I'm hearing that you're saying that voting is not the silver bullet. Marc, I'm gonna come to you very quickly. What should we do? You are going to have to vote in 2 weeks. Are you going to vote? Are you not? What are you going to do here?
I am absolutely going to vote. I have never not voted. I have voted for the Green Party for the last 20 years. And
thrown away your vote. You've thrown away your vote there. No change. No change is going to come of that. What do you say to that?
I say that it depends on how you understand voting. I think that voting is absolutely harm reduction. I think voting is absolutely a tactic. As Baldwin said, it's a means of buying time. And sometimes the goal of voting is to build a long-term vision. Sometimes voting is to stop an immediate harm. I think there have been many elections where the distinction has been relatively minimal, and I thought it was important to build a grassroots support for the Green Party. There have been moments where it was important to drag the Democratic Party to the left. This is not that moment for me. This is a moment where things are on fire. And I would argue for the vulnerable, America's always on fire. But Trump isn't really watching the fire. He's pouring gasoline on it. And Joe Biden and Donald Trump are both problematic candidates, but I don't think that they're the same. I think Donald Trump is an entirely different sort. And I think that 4 more years of Donald Trump is not only dangerous for the vulnerable here in America, but it's dangerous for any kind of a movement. As much as I dislike Joe Biden, he can be moved, he can be persuaded. And so for the first time in 20 years, I'm going to vote for the Democrats. In 24 years, I'm going to vote for the
Wow.
And I would argue that what we're seeing is someone who's not just bad for Black people. He is bad for poor white people. He is bad for the world.
Yes.
America is the most heavily armed country in the world. And let me say to you that we should not have someone behind the switch who I wouldn't let drive a golf cart. Wow, it's a bad idea.
That is a conversation we're not going to get to. I hope, Vickiana, that your question was answered. You're a little quiet there, so if I come to you again, I'm going to need you to speak up. But I want to move on now and talk about another problem. For those of us around the world who look at America in these moments and try and get our cues, both socially and politically, there is one thing that seems to come up and crop up every time that perfectly explains structural racism. Now, it has been more than 150 years since the end of slavery, but for many people, for many Americans, those entrenched views and injustices of that time are clearly present in modern day America. To give just one example, in 2018, Black Americans made up about 12% of the US population, the adult population, but they represent nearly triple that amount, 33% of the incarcerated prison population. Mark, Mikki, if I can come to you, that just leaves an absolutely bitter taste in the mouth. Every time I've read that in rehearsals, it makes me angry to think about it and to hear it. You guys know this. Mark, let me come to you first. Systematic racism, a lot of people on the right and even the conservative left say, doesn't exist. It's a rotten apple. It's just a bad person doing a bad thing. It's not the system.
That's a wonderful thought, right? Because it allows you to believe that if we could just find those bad apples, we can toss them and enjoy the rest of this beautiful, delicious fruit. The problem is that all the social evidence demonstrates that it's not an issue of bad actors, but rather the system that produces those actors. And so when we look at a mass incarceration of the vulnerable, because it's not mass incarceration. Mass incarceration would mean everybody's getting locked up. It's mass incarceration of poor Black and brown people. When we look at who's dying, we look at who's being beaten by police, we look at who's impoverished, who's dying from preventable diseases. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, who is experiencing premature death, who's vulnerable to premature death. Race is the key explanatory factor, as is poverty. And so under those circumstances, we have to understand this as systemic. And that's why I operate from the abolitionist tradition. I stand on the shoulders of people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Mariama Kaba and many others.
But Mark, you and I know that. You and I can read those facts and agree to it. How do you use this evidence, this data, to make sure that this year, 2020, to make sure that the movement as it is today, since 2014, since Ferguson, that this moment coalesces into something? That fact is heartbreaking. But so is the fact that so many young Black men and women are being killed in their homes and on the streets. So how do we translate that in a way that the rest of the world can see and we can change perspective?
But I mean, first you have for that to be persuasive, you have to care about Black lives, right? Knowing that Black trans women die every day doesn't persuade people in a world that's transphobic. Knowing that Palestinians die every day doesn't matter in a world that is anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian. Right. So part of it is if you have a population that's rendered disposable, then you'll never persuade people that their death is a crisis. So part of what we have to do is marshal up enough evidence for people who do care to be persuaded. But we also have to look to some extent at interest convergence. How do we convince people that locking up a lot of Black and brown people is in and of itself troublesome? That's a question. But another question is, how do I convince people who don't care about Black people that it's bad, that it's too expensive, that police are over? These arguments that we have to make. I don't enjoy making those kind of arguments that sort of concede to the fact that people won't accept Black humanity, but I'm willing to make them if they'll give us justice.
Mikki, are you willing to make those arguments?
I mean, I make arguments in terms of self-interest. One of the things I've learned is that I cannot convince people that Black lives matter if they think that Black people shouldn't exist, right? There's a level at which the argument you're throwing your head at the wall. So I make the argument instead based on their own self-interest. The same laws that currently negatively impact Black and brown populations at a greater percentage also negatively impact low-income white people. The same push to get rid of social safety nets, which 70% of people using those nets are more likely to be white in America. When they say welfare queens are getting blah, 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 let's cut their funds, I say, well, that actually means that Aunt Susan, who just lost her husband and has those 4 kids, that means she loses food stamps. I have stopped appealing to altruism years ago, and instead I appeal to self-interest in my arguments.
And that's a really interesting perspective. Mikki, I want to ask you, you also work in the space of women's rights, as well as Black women's rights in a general context. How can we make sure that stays on the same level as young Black men, majority of them young Black men who are dying either whilst they're being arrested or on the streets of the United States? How do we make sure that we bring both of those issues to the fore, that it's not just, oh, well, if we can solve police brutality, then we've solved racism?
Well, I actually remind people that the second most common form of police brutality is sexual assault. And the people most likely to experience the second most common form are young women of color. And so then when we move the conversation into a place where we have the same problem in different axes, these are not separate problems. They are the same thing. It just has different impacts depending upon your identity. It gets a lot easier. That doesn't mean we shouldn't say her name. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about lethal violence. It means that we should tackle this as a major societal issue that impacts all of us, just in different ways. You shouldn't want police to brutalize anybody in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marc and Mikki. Stay right where you are, because as ever, my astonishing, wonderful, astounding, brilliant audience watching Dear World Live have come through with just the most thought-provoking questions and comments there is. Remember, you've got a little more time to tell me what you think of the show. Are you enjoying it? Is this useful to you? Do you have anything to contribute? Write me your name, where it is you're watching, into the comment section of wherever you're watching right now, and I will get to as many of them as I can. Right, let's get to a few of those questions now. So we've got one from Vishjam, and Vishjam says, how do we translate BLM message into policy, I guess, sooner rather than later? We can't replace leaders. That's such a good question. How do we make sure that we turn a movement, a sentiment, into policy, into practice?
Yeah, I think part of it is what we've been seeing. Because one of the knocks against BLM that I think has been unfair and just inaccurate is that there's a lot of protesting and no policy changes. And what we've seen in the last, I would say, 6 years is a bunch of policy changes. I mean, whatever you think of body cameras, I'm not a body camera person, but the rise and normalization of body cameras and law enforcement is direct response to what's happening on the ground. But you can't run for mayor of a town anymore and not say who your police chief is going to be. It's not a passing thought anymore. It's central to how people understand what this life is going to be like. And you can't be a police chief without talking about how you're going to police. Again, I'm an abolitionist, but I'm saying these are policy shifts. The movement that we see in places like Minneapolis to defund police, that is the direct result of people agitating on the ground. How did they get there? Political education, organizing, and voting. Now, voting is not the silver bullet, but it's a tactic. Political education is not enough because people can know a lot and not go anywhere with it. And organizing, you have to be organized and engaged on the ground.
Mikki, you're nodding there.
So one of the things that I often point out is that we seem to think that these things will happen in a marathon, in a sprint, right? Today we want to get rid of this, tomorrow it is gone. And the civil rights movement took 100 years post-slavery to even get to the point of passing the Voting Rights Act. We have seen in terms of American feminism, right? White women got the vote in the 1919, but it was literally almost 50 years later before Black women's rights were protected. A few years later before Indigenous women's voting rights were protected, and they're tenuously protected, but okay, we get them. So I think that people think that BLM is supposed to, again, be a magic bullet, but getting police out of schools, funding social safety nets, better political education, better funding for mental health care, things of this nature, those are policy changes. America built this over hundreds of years. It's not going to undo it in 10 years, much less 100 years.
Thank you so much. We've got a question here, Mikki, from a fan of yours, obviously. Mikki, have you ever run for office?
I have not run for office. I have failed.
Be part of the solution, Kevin Kane says, my friend Kevin in Florida. What do you make of that? Why not be part of that change?
Well, first of all, I'm in Illinois, so I don't know if you know about Illinois politics, but I'm not willing to go to jail. Second of all,
crime town.
Our governors, you have to be a crooked. But second of all, frankly, although there are people who seek power and have the personality for it, I remind folks that the saying "absolute power corrupts" absolutely exists for a reason. And I am not the personality that is going to just smile and kiss babies. I am more likely to get into a fist fight in the State House. Sometimes you have to know who you are. What I do is fundraise. Sometimes I phone bank. I definitely donate time and energy and effort to people who I think are good candidates. I have a lot of great ideas. As a policy wonk, I might be your girl. As a person who stands in front of the camera, there is less than no chance that I would say the wrong thing.
I want it to be noted on the record, we here at Dear World Live do not endorse socking any politician or member of government. That is an absolute fact here. Final question here, because we're running out of time, guys. We're really running out of time. Final question from Ridwan in Somalia, watching on YouTube right now. Ridwan, hello. Racial inequality set roots in the US system for centuries. And when it comes to fighting against racial injustice, we're going to need to launch the campaign within the system, within Congress, and within the White House. It's a really interesting comment. What do you think about that?
I think we have to work within and without. You know, the systems themselves are not going to yield you justice, right? No one in power hands power over to those to the dominated. And so, yeah, we can work, we can agitate, we can ask for laws. I'm not against reform. You know, any reform that'll move us toward a radical or abolitionist vision is fine. What I don't want to do is create reforms that trick us into believing that the system as it stands is salvageable, that it's fixable, that it's workable. So, yeah, I don't mind picking some bad apples out, but as long as I can see that at some point I got to change this barrel. And so, you know, again, working within system, working within Congress, that's fine. But ultimately, the change we see, I mean, as Mikki brilliantly points out, over the last 100 years, 150 years, what we've seen in terms of civil rights activism and social justice, yeah, people have worked, policy laws have been changed, but those laws are co-signed in ink. They're written in the blood of people who were willing to sit on the Pettus Bridge, or who were willing to boycott buses, who were willing to lay their lives on the line every single day. That's
in which case, on that note, because we've got about 5 minutes left, let's move on to my absolute favorite part of Dear World Live. This is the part where we don't just talk about the problems, but the solutions. To all of you watching on YouTube, on Twitch, on Twitter, and on Facebook, thank you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And thank you for listening to this conversation that we've been having. I want to now bring up everyone on screen. If we can have Vickiana as well, if she's there. Can you see her? There she is. Right. For the next few minutes, I want to talk solutions. We're not going to solve the problem of racial injustice here on Dear World Live. We are an ambitious show, but we're not that good. But what we can do is make little strides towards a bigger change. You guys all live in the States. I don't. I want to be part of the solution just as much as you do. So a two-barreled question. Pick however you want to answer this. What is the one thing people who are watching you right now at home, what can they do from inside America and from outside to help be part of that change? Let me come to you first, Mikki.
So one of the things you can do from inside America, and this is a purely functional, Marc has already heard a version of this answer. You have to make sure that the people you want to see fighting are able to eat, they are able to stay housed, they are able to access medical care, all of these things. Armies march on their bellies is a saying for a reason. We cannot expect people to fight if they are struggling to survive. So there's that. For people from outside the US, your politicians are definitely listening and can sometimes put pressure on our politicians. And now is a wonderful time to push for your political figures to step up and to speak up, to push America in the same way America has felt free to push other cultures. We are the big kid on the block, but you can take down a big kid if enough of you get together. So work with us. Work with us.
I like that. Marc.
I strongly agree. Again, voting matters. It's not the answer. It's not a silver bullet, but we got elections. And when I say voting, I don't just mean the president. So much of what happens in this world happens at the local level. Voting for different councilmen, different state representatives, voting for different governors. This matters. And part of how Republicans have taken over the last few decades is by taking over at the state level. So voting, organizing, donate to grassroots campaigns, which goes back to Mikki's point, right? People are struggling out here. Many of the people who are on the ground catching the most hell, fighting for justice, need their bills paid. They need support, and the organizations need support. So do that. Stand up, speak up. And if you have power, use that power and privilege to speak back. Don't just talk about being anti-racist on Twitter. Talk about being anti-racist at the Thanksgiving table with your white family when they say racist shit. Like that stuff, excuse me. I think this is like a dignified platform.
Didn't hear it. There was a bleep. Don't worry.
These are the kinds of things. I have to speak out against patriarchy. I have to speak out against homophobia in places where it matters, when there's something at stake. Be willing to have something at stake.
Wonderful. Vickiana, I don't want you to answer that question so much as I want you to remark on what you heard from Marc and Mikki there. That's really interesting advice. What do you think?
Yes, we have so much work to do, but first and foremost, we need to start small, and we need to start with what we're able to do, and that means going out to vote come election day and early voting, and that means engaging with our parents and our friends around these conversations, around these topics, and getting it to them first and foremost, so that they're not just seeing it on social media, they're hearing it from everyone that's around them.
Yes.
And they're starting to think about these questions.
Absolutely. I'm being told we're running out of time. There's a consensus there, and there's a plan for those inside and outside America if they want to make a difference. Right. Mikki, Kendall, Marc Lamont Hill, Vickiana Petit Homme, I am so grateful to you. Thank you so much for being in this first episode of season 2 of Dear World Live. Say goodbye. Wave goodbye, folks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys. For those of you who are watching, thank you. I'm so grateful that you came to join us again. We have so many more shows coming your way. That's the end of this show for season 1, but we have 4 more episodes. We'll be talking about all aspects of racial injustice across the world. And next week, we are going to be tackling the issue of environmental racism. It will be fantastic to have you there. If not, remember, we are always on at www.dohadebates.com for more details and more ways for you to get involved in the conversation. That is all from me. I will see you next week.